Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Gini Dietrich.
And Ginny, the finance department has a few questions for you. They're not real happy, so you're going to have to deal with those
Okay,
right after this.
great.
So, I was talking with my finance team and they've got a few questions and they think we're paying a little bit too much and maybe you're not being quite accountable enough in what you're doing for this show. So, I'm going to put you in touch with them and they're going to, grill you.
That sounds amazing. Great. Thank you. Can't wait.
Yeah. And
That said no one ever.
I'm happy. I'm thrilled with the way things are going. I think it's fantastic, and I don't want to change it. Finance, their finance.
Yeah, that sounds this is why this is also advice I give. Find somebody, hire somebody on your team, either it's internally or outsourced, that handles those conversations and are good at those conversations so that you can remove yourself from it, because all that would do for me is end in not having a client.
Yeah. See, this is something that came about from a Reddit conversation that has since been deleted, so we can't actually refer back to it, but that's okay. It is something that comes up, particularly as agencies start working with larger clients that have finance teams, procurement teams, those sorts of things, and they can often make a royal mess of the relationship. And so, what we're going to talk about today is how you handle that, how you approach those kinds of issues to make sure that you're not in a situation where you suddenly have work that you're not being paid fairly for, that you don't really want to do anymore.
Yeah, it's I have a really good friend who works with a gigantic corporation, and they sent an email earlier this week and said, "We'd like to know what your hourly rates are, and we'd like to lock you in for 3 years, and we'd also like a credit back on some of the work that you do." And she sent it to me and I was like, "No." What? But this is how they negotiate with the procurement team, is this is what they do. And if you say that your managing supervisor is $200 an hour right now, by golly, it's got to be $200 an hour 3 years from now, and you're not getting a raise and they're not getting a raise, and there's no way to work around that. So I think trying to figure out the best way to handle those kinds of things. Certainly you can't say, well, our rates are $550 to accommodate for inflation and all that right later. But if you want to be working with larger companies, there has to be a way to work around that kind of stuff. But man.
And I think you just hit on the nail on the head there, which is if you want to work with big companies, right?
Yeah,
and so you need to think about whether or not that's really something you want to do. And most agencies that I've come across, they dream of working for these big brands because they're like, oh, I can put, these Fortune 100 logos on my site. And it's just, it's a heady experience. And you get all excited about it. You figure they've got big budgets. And that's all true, right? I mean, those logos do look fantastic on your website. It's great for the ego to have them. They can be big budgets, but they come with a lot of challenges. And if you are a small agency, you really have to think very carefully about whether that's the kind of business you really want to do.
Yeah. And I mean, it goes back to something we talk about all the time, which is really figuring out what it is that you want to do. And you say this all the time, like, figure out what it is that you want to do, figure out how much money you should be making, design the business around you. And if you are comfortable with procurement and contract negotiations and creating rates for the next 3 years and trying to figure out what inflation and cost of living and all of that stuff's important, but that's typically not the reason you started your agency. So you have to figure out what you're comfortable with, what your level is for dealing with that kind of stuff. And if that is something that you want to do, great. But you don't want to handle that kind of stuff. Like I said, you should be finding somebody that can handle it, outsource it, or bring somebody in internally that can help you do those kinds of things. Because from my perspective, it really would be the fastest way to losing a client, because I would just.
Right. Well, and big brands bring not just finance and procurement, but they typically bring RFPs. So,
Mhm.
I mean,
True.
at that point, from my perspective, you're 0 for 2.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but if you're going to go down that
That's a
path,
great point.
you
Yep.
have to understand what you're getting into, and you have to be realistic about it, because it's very easy to get so excited about the logo that you don't think about everything else that comes along with it.
Yeah, and I would say 0 for 3 is they expect you to do a ton of upfront work before you even get paid. A
Right.
ton in
Yep.
the new business process, in the dog and pony show, in the travel and expenses, in the meeting with people, and it could take 6 months to a year, and that's time and resources and all of that invested. And so you have to take that into consideration as well.
Well, and then you have to think about the payment terms.
0
because
for 4.
because the big brands don't just want you to do a lot of work for
No.
nothing up front. They want you to do it after you've become
Yep.
their agency as well, because they're typically going to ask for 60, 90, 120 day. I've even heard of 180-day payment terms that some big brands are asking agencies for. It's bonkers. It's absolutely nuts.
Yeah.
And so, again, if you want to do that, that's fine. You have to understand it and go into it with your eyes open. And I think Karen Swim, who is participating in our chat here, has made a great point that if you're working with these kinds of brands, you have to make sure that finance and procurement are involved from the get-go. And one of the things that often happens with procurement is you'll be working with the brand, you'll be working with the contact, and you'll say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And you'll reach an agreement on scope of work and price. And then they bring in procurement. And so you think you've got a deal, and procurement now tries to whittle it down.
Yep.
And it's very disheartening, but it also sets you up for a lot of failure. So make sure that you've got, find out right from the get-go if they've got a procurement or finance team that's going to be involved, and get them into that process as soon as possible.
It's funny, Karen, thank you for that, because I just had that experience, but for a speaking engagement where a very large company came to me and said, "Hey, we'd like you to do some workshops for our communications team of about 100 people. Would you be willing to do that?" And I was like, "Yeah." And we worked out the deal, we worked out the scope and everything, and then procurement got involved. And I was like, "Oh, no, I mean, no. We worked out a deal. That's what I'll do it for, and if you're not willing to do it, then I'm out. And I also don't want to do it right this close to Christmas." So
Right.
so it's fine. But yeah, I mean, we worked months on that, and then they brought procurement in. So that is great advice that I didn't even consider, at making sure that they're involved from the very very beginning, because that would have saved us a lot of time and angst.
Honestly, I'm not even sure I would have thought about asking for procurement's involvement in something like that, because that's not typically something that procurement is going to
Yeah.
get involved in. But yeah, I mean, it's always helpful to ask those questions so that, I mean, we're trained to think about, okay, what's your budget? Who's your decision maker? Those kinds of things. But find out if you've got these other players who are going to have to be involved in some way, shape, or form. And if they're going to be involved, then you probably seriously want to consider a Peta tax in your pricing.
Yes.
Because, if they're going to be a pain in the butt, then you want to make sure that you're getting compensated even more
That's
fairly, particularly because they're probably going to whittle it down. And what you think you're getting compensated is not what you're going to end up with at the end of the day, no matter
true.
what the contract says.
So speaking of that tax, what do you normally do? A percentage?
At this point in my career, I end up with sort of a gut feel. And so
Yeah.
I just, it's not a set percentage. It's, it's you just sort of sit there and look at it and you say, okay, well, normally I charge 5K for this. This is going to be 7,500.
Yeah.
Or, you really, and it depends on the scope of the work and all that kind of thing, but just assume that it's all going to take longer than you think, that they're going to try to nickel and dime you at some point. You certainly, we talk about pricing a lot, but pricing has to be a function not just of the work that you're doing, but also the payment terms. And so if you're going to extend 90, 120-day payment terms, you essentially need to be compensating yourself as if you're loaning money to them.
Yeah.
And so there needs to be an imputed interest rate to your pricing to make up for that. And so those are all things that you need to be thoughtful about. And at the end of the day, you just want to make sure that, as my old business partner called it, the pain per dollar ratio is something that you can live with.
And I will also add to that usually if you're adding a PETA tax, it's not worth it in the end.
Well, there's that too. I mean, look, I am generally of the mindset that you should avoid, if you have an RFP and procurement involved, you should probably run.
Yep, I agree with that.
I mean, I think that 99% of the time for a small agency, it's not worth it. Now, if you're a big agency and you've got your own
Yep.
legal and accounting team that they can handle a lot of it, and you've got these giant bankrolls that you can afford to be paid 6 months after the fact,
Jeez.
go for it. I mean, I think it's still not a good idea, but go for it. I mean, at that point, the people who are running the business, typically it's not their own money anyway, so
Fair.
go for
Yep.
it. But if you're a small agency, you need to be thinking about not just the logos that are on your website, not the top line revenue. You need to think about the work that you're doing, the amount of money that you're taking home, and just your quality of life.
Yeah.
And generally that doesn't mix with these big brands that want to, nail you with procurement.
I would also say, with the exception of the gigantic brands, that most organizations really just want to work with agencies that they know they have an expertise, they know that they know their industry, and that they know they're going to get results. So for most organizations, they don't care if you've worked with IBM or GE or Apple or whoever, Amazon or Peloton or whoever happens to be. They care that you've done really good work. And so I would focus my time on showcasing that work and doing a really good job of showcasing the results that you get with the budget and the ideas and all that, versus trying to get those big brand logos on your website. And truth be told, we did work with GE for years. We couldn't put their logo on our website.
Right.
So
well, there's that too, right? If you're doing it so that you can get the logo, make sure you can actually get the logo.
You can't. Most of them won't let you do it.
Correct. And it's, look, I mean, as someone, we talked in a recent episode about, being on the client side of the agency client relationship. Yep. When I've hired agencies for my businesses in the past or places I've worked, I don't really care about the logo slide in the deck. I don't go to their website to look. Well, frankly, I don't usually go to the website for anything.
At all.
Right. I mean, we in the agency world, we overestimate that logo slide and our website logo page and all that kind of stuff. Nobody cares.
No one cares. Yeah.
They just don't.
Yep.
And logo slides are actually a double-edged sword anyway, because it sometimes can make it harder to get the smaller clients. Right.
Sure.
So if you've got one big brand and you've got, most of your bread and butter is the SME market, you're going to have a hard time, because they're going to look and say, well, geez, I'm no GE.
I can't compete.
I can't compete. They're going to be too expensive. They're not going to pay attention to me.
Yep.
So, so think about it from that perspective. But let's say, I mean, the purpose of this episode is you've already agreed to go into a relationship with someone who's got a finance and procurement team, right? So if we haven't talked you out of it in the last 10 minutes, we're probably never going to talk about it. So if you find yourself in that situation, how do you handle those kinds of conversations?
There are a couple of things that we have done, and it certainly depends, as you well know. But we've done a few things where we'll work with procurement and the account team and create an opportunity for us to start work now. And then, wait the 90 days or whatever happens to be. And then the moment we get a check, then we actually start the work. So we'll get all into the system and do everything. And, then the team may send stuff over for us to read and, start to get knowledgeable, but we don't actually start work until we get the first check. That doesn't always work, but it is an option that I've used several times with big brands to be able to get started. And I'm just perfectly frank with them. I'm like, look, we're a small business. I don't have a huge bankroll. I don't have a line of credit. Like I can't do this work and pay my team if I'm not getting paid. So I explain it from that perspective. And usually they're pretty good about that. And so it kind of feels a little bit like you're tricking procurement. But that is one option that we've tried that typically works.
Right. And just to be clear, you're not suggesting you work before you have a signed document. You're suggesting that you'll do it before you start getting paid, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, make sure you have a signed agreement.
Right. Yeah. Like we get all that done, and then we submit the first invoice, and then we wait to get paid, and then we start the work.
Right. But it is not uncommon for the client team to say, yes, let's do this, and them want you to start going, and just say, well, just work it out with procurement. You're going to get paid for this. Don't worry about it.
Nope.
Worry about it.
Yes,
Worry about it.
definitely worry about it.
Right. And also be really
Yes.
careful about incurring any additional expenses in those early stages of the relationship. If you've got a long payment cycle or something like that, don't go out and hire new people or get big subscriptions or
Media
buy
buys
ads or
right.
anything like that.
Yep.
Make sure that that at most what you're putting at risk is your staff time, right? Which is still bad.
It's bad, but yeah, not as bad as.
But it's not as bad as these third-party expenses that I've seen get brought in, and then you find out that they're going to delay payment even more, and all of a sudden now you really are becoming a bank, and there's no reason why a small agency should be a bank for GE or someone like that. I mean, frankly, a large agency shouldn't be, right? And we're not meaning to pick on GE here, so if you're listening from GE, it's just an easy name to say. So.
I mean, we really did do work with them, and it was a great experience. But yeah, they were very they had rules. You couldn't put them on the website. You could talk about them, but you couldn't put them in a deck. You couldn't.
Right.
So in a new business presentation, I could say we work with GE, and I could talk about it, but I couldn't even do a case study in a presentation. They were super strict about that stuff. But they are one of the ones that we worked out ahead of procurement to be able to make sure that we were getting paid. And I never took on an expense. I always said, all right, either give me a credit card or you make this, the invoice goes to GE or whatever happens to be, because that's how they make their money right? I mean,
right. Yeah.
They use your money to make money. So.
Exactly. They're taking the float, and that's just completely wrong.
Yeah.
And it's, there are brands that are better than others, right? So we shouldn't paint with one brush, because you say, GE was great to work with. I've worked with plenty of Fortune 100 brands over the years that were fantastic to work with. There are some that I will never, ever, ever entertain a conversation with ever again, no matter how big the contract is, because it's just not worth it. And so, unfortunately, those are things you will learn from experience. But if you're thoughtful about how you protect yourself, you can at least, minimize the risk, shall we say.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. Yeah, the accounting departments are often a nightmare, so that easily can turn from 90 to 180. You're right. I love the whole.
Yeah, that's a comment that Karen Swim from Solo PR Pro has offered up in the chat. For those of you who are listening to the podcast.
Sorry. We never got the invoice, and you're like, come on, I can see you opened it.
Right. Right. Yeah, accounting departments are sometimes very good at sitting on invoices, even if the payment terms say that they're supposed to pay up. And you should be, we're not just talking about Fortune 100 brands here. This also comes into play a lot if a small agency is doing work for a large agency. Some of the large agencies are just as bad, if not worse, than the big consumer brands and that sort of thing when it comes to finance departments and payment terms. So, don't say to yourself, oh, we're in the same boat, we do the same thing. Nope.
Well, and that always rolls downhill too, because then you hire contractors to help you, but then you can't pay them until you get paid. And it's just this vicious cycle. So
correct.
It's
right.
Yeah.
And so those are all absolute problems. Now, all of that said, all of the trashing that we've just done of finance and accounting, finance and procurement, I will say you should go into the conversations with them not assuming they're going to be the enemy. More often than not, they are. But sometimes they can be an ally, and even if they're not, going into it with that negative attitude is probably going to lead to an unproductive conversation. For sure. So go into it with an open mind. Just know that they may have the the stiletto behind their back that they're going to jab you with when you're not looking.
I hope it's a really expensive one, like a Jimmy Choo, or that they're using.
Isn't a stiletto a knife?
Oh, I was thinking shoe. No. Stiletto shoe.
Yeah, and I think it's a knife too.
That's how we differ right there.
Yeah,
that's funny.
That was not where my mind went. Anyway, so go, because I have had situations where I've actually been able to take advantage of the procurement team to help me deal with some issues with the client. right? And a lot of this comes down to what kind of finance or procurement team that you're working with. So if you are working with a business that doesn't have a lot of experience dealing with agencies or professional service firms, it's going to be a lot more challenging. So I've done some work with some manufacturing companies in the past that their procurement departments had no idea how to deal with agencies. It was just not something that they really did. And so they approached it all more from the standpoint that they would of a vendor who's selling them widgets of some kind.
Right.
And so, that just makes for a very awkward conversation because the things they're worried about aren't even relevant
Right.
to the conversation.
Right.
And you'll see this in the contract language. I know we've talked about this before where they'll, put in requirements for, vehicle insurance and right. And you're like, I'm doing it all over Zoom. There's no vehicle involved.
Right.
Why do I have to name you
Right.
in my vehicle insurance
Right.
policy?
Right.
It
Yeah,
makes no
that's a
sense.
really great point. And there are often conversations in the Counselors Academy Facebook group about that very thing. Like, I'm being asked for our life insurance and our all sorts of insurance that you're just like, what? Why?
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't. Vehicle insurance, that doesn't make sense. I'm never leaving my desk.
Right. Exactly. And this is just something that you need to, I mean, as we've said in contracts, you always need to look at everything they're asking you to sign. And particularly when you're dealing with finance and procurement, there can be a desire to blow through it as quickly as you can. Because you've already reached in your mind the agreement with the client. This is what we're doing. This is how much, so let's just get this paperwork out of the way. And so, and most times if procurement or finance is involved, they don't just have you sign a contract, they have you sign all sorts of other stuff that goes along with it, certifications and this and that, and read them, understand them, know what you are committing to.
I'm just going to say that this is why I don't do RFPs or work with procurement departments, because I don't have the time or the patience.
The other thing that you need to be aware of if you're dealing with procurement and finance is they don't go away after the deal is signed. There's this assumption that they only show up again if there's going to be a new contract. And that's not true. A lot of times procurement likes to do their own check-ins. So, you may be doing, regular client check-ins, but sometimes procurement wants to do a quarterly or semi-annual check-in as well. And you're like, why?
Why? Right.
And I've been down this road, and I've had to sit down for like half-day conversations with procurement where I have to justify everything that the business is doing for them.
Are you kidding?
No.
Yeah. See, I told you, this is the fastest way for me not having any clients.
Yeah. I mean, it is why I am generally very negative on working through an RFP or procurement type process, because it generally doesn't end well unless you have a lot of resources on your end to throw at it. And, I know that that's not a popular position because people do like the idea of working for the big brands with the big budgets and all that kind of stuff. But I think most of the time it's not worth it. But
I also think that was more relevant 10 years ago, but in the world that we live in today, there are plenty of budgets and plenty of money in certain industries. Like if you're in travel and hospitality,
absolutely
not necessarily. But if you're in the startup world or tech, working with entrepreneurs, there's plenty of money to go around.
Plenty of money, plenty of opportunity, plenty of places where you don't have to deal with these things.
Yes.
And so you want to know if they're involved from the get-go, as Karen suggested, and then if they are, get them involved or walk away, one or the other.
That's how
and just understand, don't shortcut any of those conversations. Make sure that you're actually engaged in them if you're going to continue down that path. Make sure you understand what they're asking. Make sure that you figure out, what the pitfalls are and that you're protecting yourself and you're not just doing their bidding because they're big and you're small.
Yeah. And to close this out, I 100% agree that you have to pay attention to the stuff that they. Hi, Doe. Hi.
Doug Haslam has chimed in. See, I've got to work with you on this, Jenny.
I know.
See, this goes out as an audio podcast where people don't see us. So the fact that I put a comment on the screen.
I have to tell people that Doug is here and he's been riding his bike again, which I see on Strava, and I'm very proud of you.
Yes.
Go get him, buddy.
Absolutely. We're very happy about that. I don't understand it. I mean, I'm not a bike rider. I'm not a bike rider.
He had a really bad cycling accident. And he's getting back on the bike. So.
Which is why I will never get on a bike. One of many reasons, but
one of many. Yeah.
I much prefer to run rather than to ride a bike. So
I have no idea what I was saying, but I'm more happy that Doug was here. So
Yeah, you were trying to wrap up. So that's what we'll do, because since this is a behind the scenes episode of the Small Agency Talk Show where we're recording the podcast, we crash land every episode.
We do actually crash land. Yes, that's true.
So this is one of the least bad crash landings that we've had. So with that, I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Ginny Dietrich.
And it depends. Thank you for listening to the Agency Leadership Podcast. You can watch or listen to every episode by visiting agencyleadershippodcast.com. The Agency Leadership Podcast is distributed on the FIR Podcast Network. Just visit www.firpodcastnetwork.com. We welcome your feedback and suggestions and look forward to being back with you again next week.